This is a video showing you how to dye RC parts using RIT dye. All that you're going to need for it is obviously some RIT dye. There's two different kinds. There's the powder and the liquid. Either one works perfectly fine. You're going to need some fishing line and scissors as well, and a pot to boil this all in, but I'll talk about that later on. Now, onto the parts that you're going to be dyeing. There's a couple rules that you have to follow. Only parts that are white or off-white can be dyed any color. That includes yellow, pink, you name it, you can do it as long as you can find the dye. Any plastic part that's not white, there's going to be some rules to follow. First of all, if it's gray, you cannot dye it yellow. If it's black, you cannot dye it red. You can only go a darker shade than what the part originally is. So, just to make things a little bit easier, here's a chart showing you exactly what I mean. And I should go ahead and talk to you guys about dyeing parts that are not made out of plastic. For example, shock springs. Sometimes when you dye them, they turn out perfect. Other times, they turn out terrible. They'll come out this weird purplish black. It's an ugly color. And it's completely unpredictable. At times I've been able to do it. Other times I just can't do it. Doesn't matter if I use a powdered or liquid form of the dye. So I wouldn't really suggest it. Only stick to dyeing plastic, because other parts that are made of metal and stuff, the results are just not guaranteed. Now when it comes to dyeing chrome, when you use black, sometimes it turns it into black chrome. Doesn't always happen, but when it does look really good. However, it can be scratched off rather easily. As you can see, the nut has scratched off the dye. Now, before you dye any of the parts, be sure that you scrub every part of it down and get it as clean as possible. Dirt and grime will block the dye from getting to the plastic, so if you dye it and then you scratch it away, you'll see the natural color be underneath it. So be sure that your parts are completely clean. Also, when it comes to things like glue, the dye cannot penetrate it. So you'll see that the red is actually still there because the glue is keeping the dye from penetrating the plastic. And for some reason, glue cannot be dyed black, so just be wary of that. So once all your parts are cleaned up, then you're ready to go ahead and string them together. What you're going to want to do is get a good amount of fishing line, cut it, and of course loop it through the parts and then tie the ends off. This way you can lift all the parts out of the dye to check on them regularly. You don't want them sitting in there, and you just don't want to pour the whole pot out just to get a certain part out. It's just a waste. You don't want to tie the string really tight to the part. You want it to be incredibly loose. Otherwise the string can prevent the dye from getting to the area that it's in contact with. And you just go ahead and double knot it. It doesn't have to be anything special. You can string all the parts to one thing together, or you can just do one individually. Personally, I like to do it all on one loop. But yeah, just a double knot is more than enough to hold it together. As you can see, I went ahead and tied both of the rims together with one loose piece of fishing wire. Now, for light plastics that aren't that dense, you're going to have to be careful when you dye them, because you can warp them from the heat. However, with dense plastics and metal springs, for instance, it's going to take a long time at higher heat in order for you to dye them. The dye has to penetrate the surface, and the hotter it gets, the more the surface area expands, allowing the dye to get in there. Now it's time to get the dye ready. So you're going to want to find a pot that's big enough for the part to be completely submerged into the water. Now if you're dyeing something big like a chassis, you can go ahead and use a turkey pot. Just make sure that the water level goes high enough for the parts to be completely submerged. Go ahead and test it out and put the parts in there before you put the dye in to make sure, yes, they are fully submerged. Now there's something I should go ahead and tell you right now. This does not ruin the pot that you're boiling the RIT dye in. You can easily clean it afterwards and use it safely to cook food afterwards. So if you don't have too much confidence in me, just go ahead and follow the instructions that are on the package. But this is how I do it. First of all, I turn the heat all the way on to high and get the water boiling. Once the water starts to boil, you're going to bring it down to low medium. So if yours counts from 1 to 10, put it at 3. I got the powder ready. If you have the liquid stuff, same step, and just pour it in there. And now you are ready to put your parts in. To make things a bit easier, you can go ahead and use a fork, a butter knife, whatever, and just wrap the fishing line around it. That way, when you lower it in there, the line won't get lost. And like I said, make sure that the parts are completely submerged, and then you just go ahead and move this off to the side. Once the part is in the dye, all you have to do is let it sit in there. Make sure you pull it out and check it every 5 minutes. And like I said, have it on low, medium heat, otherwise the part will start warping. If it does start to warp, then make sure you turn down the heat ASAP. And like I said, every 5 minutes, pull it out, check it out, and see how it looks. 5 minutes have gone by. I'm going to go ahead and pull these out and see how they look. And yes, the dye is already taking effect. So the total amount of time that this takes varies, but I do find that if you leave it in there for about 30 minutes to an hour, checking every 5 minutes, the dye will penetrate the plastic well enough for it to get plenty of scratches and the plastic underneath will not show. So back in for 5 minutes, I'll check it every 5 minutes until it's done. Now if the water evaporates and the water line goes down, you can add some more water to it. Just be sure not to splash any of the dye. This dye will stain things really quickly. And like I mentioned, you can use this pot afterwards, but sometimes the dye will dye the pot. It's not toxic, but it might have an effect on just at least the look. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this up with a little bit of water, let another 5 minutes go by, check it again, and see how it looks. So while I have the rims in there for a little bit longer, there's a couple of things I should go ahead and mention. Make sure that the knot you tie in the fishing line is really tight. And don't let the knot go into the dye, because it can cause the fishing line to expand and it can undo the knot. And you don't want to lose a fishing line inside the dye. Believe me, that just sucks. Other than that, make sure that you have your fishing line long enough for you to set it off to the side. You don't want it hanging off the side or getting it close to the element, otherwise it can burn it, and that's not good either. So I've kept a very close eye and checked on them every 5 minutes, and 30 minutes have gone by, and as you can see, they look done. So at this point, what I'm going to do is let them dry off as much as I possibly can let them, bring them over to the paper towel, and then take them straight to the sink. Turn the water on low, and then just go ahead and rinse off all the dye. Try not to splash it around because it will dye things, like I mentioned, guys. And once all the dye is off, go ahead and pat them dry, and you are done. Quite an amazing difference, if I do say so myself. Now after you rinse it off and dry it, and you notice there's still some light parts on there, as you can see there's a little bit of blue. The black hasn't penetrated it all the way. What you're going to do is just pop it right back into the dye and put the temperature a little bit higher. And check it out, the rim is finally done. So there's a couple other things that I should go ahead and talk to you about before I end this video. If you want to go ahead and try dyeing plastics that are really dense or thick, you are going to have to increase the temperature of the dye. Not to mention, it is going to take a longer time for the dye to take effect. These controllers are usually gray, but I was able to take the casing off and dye it black, but it did take a long time at a higher temperature. If you plan on dyeing parts that are really big, like a chassis, I highly suggest that you use more than 1 packet of dye. 2 packets usually is enough, but if you want to be safe, go ahead and use 3. If you're willing to chance it, yes, you can dye the casing for electronics such as servos and ESCs. But be careful, electronics that are even mentioned to be waterproof can still be damaged from the heat and being completely submerged in water. If you're going to try to do this, make sure that you pull out the electronical part every 5 to 10 seconds, let it cool before dipping it in. It takes a long time, but the results do look rather good. One of the biggest benefits to dyeing compared to painting RC parts is that paint easily scratches off. However, dye does not scratch off. But if a scratch does go deep enough into the plastic, it can expose original color. That's not too big of a problem because you can just toss a part right back into the dye and it covers it up very nicely. Now, one thing I should go ahead and mention, the longer you dye an RC part, the better and deeper the dye will penetrate the plastic. Thus, deeper scratches won't show up the original plastic. So just be wary of how long you dye your parts. The shorter amount of time you dye your parts, the thinner the surface of plastic that is going to be exposed to it. However, the longer you dye it, the deeper the dye goes. Another thing that dyes very well black is wires. However, I have to mention that you still have to follow the same color scheme as I mentioned with the plastic parts. And finally, a question that I get asked a lot is, when you dye RC parts, does it make the plastic brittle? Honestly, there's a lot of people who say the opposite. When you boil it in water, it tends to loosen up the molecules, making the plastic more flexible so it won't break as easily. And then there's other people who argue that when you do that, it actually does make it more brittle. Honestly, I have never seen a difference. I actually would have to lean more on the fact that when you boil them and dye, it does make it more flexible. But it's not enough for it to actually hinder it or make it any weaker. The only other thing that I need to cover is, where do you buy RIT dye? Well guys, this stuff is made to dye clothes, so you will find it in the laundry area. It's not very expensive. I mean, I find the powder form for about $2. The liquid form is about $1 more expensive. Is there a difference? No, there really isn't. But that's all that I have to tell you guys. I hope this helped you out, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask.